Designers have been waiting for this new technology of linking fonts to their web pages for a long time, for literally as long as the web has been around. We really haven't had control over typography. And while a lot of people sort of think of it as decoration, the reality is it's a level of visual communication that we've had for 6 centuries, right? Bringing that to the web is actually really important. And we can see that because people have been trying to do that with various hacks and other uses of technology to get fonts to the web. They've used images and Flash and things like that. But now that we can actually use real fonts on the web, all the benefits of text are available to that text still in that typeface. So text will remain searchable and selectable and translatable and available to accessible devices and have all of this tradition of typography. Having more type on the web just means that we have a lot more diversity of how web pages can look and act and behave. We have been limited to literally about 4 or 5 typefaces since the beginning of the web. And that's because we had to rely on what, designers had to rely on what their users had installed and sort of make recommendations for what the font should be. And now they're going to have libraries of thousands of fonts, that they can pick and choose as they please to get kind of whatever effect that they're looking for from their web pages. We've also seen this with really big companies as well that have had their brands represented by a specific typeface for decades and have not been able to translate that over onto the web, and now they can. And they can do it in a web native way, which is a really big change. Technology is increasingly in place now, right? The browsers have been upgraded to use fonts and use CSS3 and HTML5. So that's happening and that's really good. They are all doing it slightly differently now, which is kind of what we've always seen with web technology, right? We saw that with JavaScript and dynamic pages. Every browser had slightly different implementations. The same is true for fonts. So one of the things that we've been doing at Typekit is smoothing all of that out, right? So you literally put a single line of code in your page, and the right browser and the right operating system gets the right font. We have different formats, different ways of delivering the font for each one of those. So it'll work all the way back to IE6 and in devices like the iPad now, and we cover all of that with all the different differences between all of those things. The other part of the equation is that fonts represent the intellectual property of type designers that go back for years. Tremendous amount of effort has gone into the development of these typefaces, and they're a little concerned, rightly so, about just putting them on the web. We've seen what's happened in the music industry and the entertainment industry in general, where music and videos have spread across the web in a way that has concerned a lot of the owners of that intellectual property. And they've responded with lawsuits and things like that. Type industry generally hasn't gone down that path, but at the same time wants a little bit of protection for their intellectual property. And so that licensing issues is another thing that Typekit has been working really hard on. Standard license for all web fonts and a tiny bit of protection of that intellectual property so that we can start using fonts today and not wait for some future web font format that may include the protection someday. We have built Typekit to support kind of 3 different audiences. One is that sort of very high-end corporate design, large-scale publishing. We work with the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. We have a bunch of relationships there. They want to use typography, and they can afford to use typography, and they've created their own fonts, or they do big licensing deals and things like that. We also realize that young, independent designers are also like creating some of the most interesting and innovative stuff on the web and don't necessarily have access to the resources to have such big libraries. And so we created Typekit as a subscription service. So you don't actually go to Typekit and buy a font. What you do is you buy a license, or rather a subscription that allows you to have access to an entire library. So you can pick and choose the fonts, and then we work with the foundries to reimburse them based on how popular their fonts are, right? It's a relatively straightforward model like that. The third group that we're working with quite extensively are people who publish online that aren't designers and aren't developers, but want to have a website that represents who they are. And this is typically in the blog world. Like we work with WordPress.com, the folks over at 6 Apart, and some of the other blog platforms to give them access like they would with themes, traditionally, a WordPress theme, for example, but now with typography on top of that. So that opens up a market of millions and millions of websites that the type industry has really never had access to before. So that's sort of the whole range of working with all of these different consumers of type, whether they're designers or not. The devices that are shipping now have various levels of support for @FontFace, which is the technology behind linking to fonts. I think it's going to be pretty important because we see brands, websites, web services, when they move to a mobile space, they may have a slightly different product offering, but they want to maintain that brand. And so bringing the fonts over to the mobile devices is just as important, especially devices like the iPad or other tablet computers that are coming out, which are really meant for reading and publishing and that kind of stuff. There's a really great experience there. So we're supporting them as fast as we can. Again, they all do different implementations, and there's some really significant bandwidth concerns. So we're doing a lot of things around making fonts as optimized as we possibly can for the web, subsetting the number of characters, the number of letters and numbers that are in the font so that we can compress it down and make it as small as possible to transmit it to any kind of device in any situation, regardless of how much bandwidth there is. So the relationship between designers and their users, I think, is only going to improve with these technologies. It does give designers more control over the look and feel of their websites, but I don't think that removes any sort of control from the users and how they interact with those websites. In fact, I think it gives them more control because it's just HTML. It's just text. Whereas before, if you were to say you wanted to control the typeface, so you put everything in an image or you put everything in a Flash file and tried to use fonts that way, well, people couldn't search the page, and they couldn't use something like Google Translate to translate the text into their own language. Searching was more difficult. Accessible devices was nearly impossible to use with a lot of these techniques that designers are using to get control over fonts. So I think designers will have more control over how their pages look and concurrently give their users more control over how they can access that content that they're trying to get to. My favorite font. Well, I don't have a very good answer for that because I have a bunch of different favorites based on a bunch of different contexts. But I am a published author as well, so I wrote a book a number of years ago. That book was set in a font called Meta. It's designed by Eric Spiekerman, who's an amazing type designer. As one of the first commercial typefaces that we added to the Typekit library was Meta. So I was just so happy that I could finally use that typeface that I have this long relationship with in my web pages now. So I'm going to go ahead and say Meta is my favorite typeface right now.